Hey, I'm Alex Pfeiffer. Today, Bill Shoemaker is going to be helping me out. We're going to be rebuilding this 2JZ head.
So what we're doing here is we're machining a valve guide stop. What it does is it'll hold the guide in place as we press the new guides in. If you have a guide that's installed too far into the head, you'll have a problem with the valve coming back up and hitting the tip of the valve guide.
Now you see the tool that we just created. This will help us put the guides into the head and get them to the right depth we want.
The factory guides are all steel guides. They're put in very tightly. You'll notice when you drive them out how extremely tightly they are. The new bronze guides will actually measure about a 1/2 thousandths larger than the ones that came out, but they'll slide right in. The expansion rate of the bronze is different than the steel.
So now what we're doing is we're actually using a honing stone inside our valve guide, and this will give us just the right tolerance that we want for our valves. We're cleaning the head. Now what we're doing is we're actually marking all the seats. We're going to be grinding the seats down. We want to mark it because we want to be able to see the cut and see the angle of the cut while we're doing it.
Okay, we're getting ready to set up the machine to cut for the proper valve seat. We're going to do the intake valve. This little tool shows me where the edge of the intake valve seat is going to be. Okay, we got the pilot that we use to check the guides with. We install that, get it nice and tight and snug down in the guide. Okay, this is the tool that we've already set up to cut. So we're going to install this in the machine. This is a closer look at the grease line that shows exactly where the valve is going to sit on the seat. Here's the machine cutting the cylinder head. We're taking a light cut to see where the imperfections are. I know the head is bowed a little bit, and we'll find out after we finish this cut. This is a seal installer for installing the seals on the top of the valve guides.
Now today we're also going to be installing these Brian Crower retainers and the Brian Crower valve springs. This is going to be a good combination for us because we're using the Brian Crower 272 cams. It's basically a stage 3 kit. It'll increase our RPM band, and in order for us not to have valve float, you kind of want to lighten up your valve train a lot. These titanium retainers are a lot lighter than the original factory ones that we have here that are just normal steel. Now also, the valve springs themselves will have a little bit tighter spring pressure and allow us to have less valve float at a higher RPM.
I'm going to install this. I got a little bit of grease on there. There's oil in the guide, oil in the seat. I kind of rotate it. I can feel where the seal hits it. And we'll slowly let this thing up.
Hi, I'm Alex Pfeiffer. We're over here at G Dimensions, and we're going to be putting together this 2JZ bottom half. You know, Steven over here is going to be helping me make sure I don't make any mistakes. As you can see, we got our Brian Crower crank here, our CP pistons, our Brian Crower rods. We pretty much have everything lined up and ready to assemble, so let's just get to it. Right here you're looking at the little ring packet that they got for us. We marked each one of our ring packets with numbers so we know which cylinder is which. Now on our top ring we know we're going to have to cut it a little bit. We're going to use this piston ring cutting tool. Now we have the new CP pistons and the BC rods. Now that the rings are properly gapped, we're going to be assembling these components so we can get it together once the crank is in. As you notice, the wrist pins are actually a lot stronger than the factory wrist pins. Right now we're just putting the rest of the wrist pins and pistons together. This is a set of the stock pistons and rods that we took out of the motor. As you can see, the rod itself and the piston is casted, which means it's really big and heavy. Which brings us to our nice CP pistons and BC rods. You have a H pattern in the BC rods, which increases the strength by a lot, but also reduces the amount of weight. The bearings that we picked up are the ACL race bearings. When you get them, these are going to be our main bearings, but one side has a groove and one side doesn't. Now what we're going to do is we're going to place our crank into the engine and we're going to plastic gauge our bearings to make sure that we're within our tolerances. What we're doing right now is prepping the studs to go into the block. So now in reverse pattern, we're going to be loosening these back up again. And then taking them off. So in order to check our plastic gauge, what we're doing is you're lining up these little lines here. Each gap shows you what the tolerance is going to be. Now we're just going to pull the crank back out of the block. And then we're going to prep the bearings and all the surfaces. Now we're just going to put in all our rod caps. Now what we did was we took off all the bearing caps and we're going to be putting the bearings in. So what we're doing with the ring tool is we're tightening it down and making sure we compress all the rings. As you can see, a couple of things to mention on the head gasket itself is Toyota automatically uses an 87mm bore on their head gasket, so we don't have to order anything special for this. Now that we got all our washers in place, we're going to be installing the studs. Now the trickiest thing about setting up this head is going to be setting up the cams. You know, a couple of major things is getting the valve lash correct. Previously you saw us cut all the valves and cut all the seats. Now what that does is also changes the height of these shims. Since this is a solid lifter engine, the only way for you to adjust this is by adjusting it with different size shims. Now we got our exhaust side cam and basically the same thing. Make sure you go ahead and put some assembly lube on all the bearing surfaces. As you can see, we already have some lube on there from doing the valve lash. Now we got all our bearing caps. What you'll notice on each bearing cap, it'll either say intake or exhaust. What we're doing right now is starting all the bolts. You don't really want to put much pressure on it yet. What you want to be doing is moving the cam down evenly. Now that we got the cams into place, it's time for us to start putting some of the accessories back on the engine. Here's our oil pump. We're going to take our cover and stick it on. Now that we got our oil pump all snugged down, we're going to be installing our new water pump. On this one, all the bolts are pretty much the same size. We have a marked intake and exhaust. The only thing you have to remember is to line up the dowel pin. Next is going to be our tensioner assembly. Now that we got our timing belt on, we just went ahead and put this little plate here. It's just to make sure that the belt doesn't slide off and hit your cover. Now here is going to be our cam card, and this is what we're going to use for reference as to when the valves open and close, also what our valve lash is. So what we did right now is we went ahead and put a degree wheel on the crank, and we just use a little piece of welding wire and bent it to where 0 is going to be. Once you put your gauge on here and you tap it a couple times, make sure it's pushed up a little bit, and then you'll 0 that out. The degree that the valve actually opens to 50 is where we're going to be taking our measurement. Now that we've done the cam timing, that's pretty much all the important sections that we need to cover putting this motor back together. I mean, you still have to put the accessories back on there, you know, put the valve covers back on, the engine mounts, oil pan, but all that portion of it is pretty straightforward. There's multiple different styles on the 2J, so, you know, we're not going to cover all of that. You're probably going to get bored. But what we'll probably do is, you know, hopefully have this thing up on the dyno and show you what kind of numbers this thing's going to create. You know, I'd like to thank my sponsors, G Dimensions, Speedomotive, Brian Crowder, CP Pistons, you know, Bullseye Turbo. You know, this build has been quite extraordinary, and you're going to see the rest of this over at DRIFTING.COM. So we'll see you then.